So welcome everyone. This is the second briefing that we've done with Richard. So apologies to anyone that was on the one earlier in the summer and has already kind of heard the brief bio. So I'll make it very brief, but this is for people that don't know Richard. Richard Pater is the new chief exec of BICOM. Started in that role in March, is the first BICOM chief exec to be someone that's permanently based in Israel, but he's actually been with the organization as director of our Israel office for well over a decade, was there before I started at We Believe, so that's going back quite a bit. And has lived in Israel. Richard grew up here in the UK and was a UJS activist, and then made Aliyah just over 20 years ago. Served in the IDF in the Tank Corps during the Second Intifada, and then was in the Prime Minister's office as a spokesperson to the English language media. So he had kind of extensive experience prior to joining BICOM, and then has been with us for a long time. I'm going to start with a few questions that I kind of prepared that I hope capture some of the main themes of what's going on at the moment. And then, but I've got about 4 questions, and then that will leave plenty of time for questions from the floor. For anything that I didn't cover, or that you want to kind of come back on things that Richard has said and understand them better, or probe for more detail, but really anything to do with Israel and its relations with other countries, particularly its relations with the UK, Richard will be happy to try to answer. The way that we will do the questions when we get to them is that you will need to put your questions in the chat function, because it gets a bit messy if I allow people to kind of unmute and start calling questions across. So people write their questions in the chat, and then I will find questions and read them out, and I'll try and group them together so that if there are any that are on the same theme. So, but just to start with some kind of openers from me, Richard, the first one is obviously the big topic of debate amongst everyone that's following questions of Israel this summer has been, would there be a move towards extension of sovereignty, and or some people describe it as annexation. That didn't happen around the 1st of July deadline. To use kind of modern online parlance, is extension of sovereignty or annexation still a thing? Is there any prospect of it happening? When would that be, and what might it look like? Richard, over to you.
Hi, Luke. Sorry, thank you first of all, thank you, Luke, for hosting me again, and thank you all for joining me. I'm very happy to answer all your questions coming up. If I just start, and there was a few aspects of that question, I'm just making notes. If you can just repeat it for 1 second, Luke, I just want to capture all of the aspects of it.
It was, is extension of sovereignty or annexation still a thing? Is there any prospect of it happening? When would that happen, if it was going to happen, and what form would it take, or might it take?
All right, sorry, thank you. Yes, I want to answer all of those in kind of specifically and separately. Is it still a thing? Well, it kind of depends who you ask. In terms of the government, and we'll probably talk about the government coalition in a little bit, I'm sure, as well. But it also depends who you ask within the government. For the Prime Minister, and I was speaking to some of the Prime Ministers, they certainly still a thing. It's not the authority that it had kind of earlier this year, leading up to, as you mentioned, the July the 1st wasn't a deadline, but it was kind of a self-imposed date that the coalition agreement established that it could be implemented by then. Since then, other aspects have happened. I think on this aspect, blue and white party within the coalition showed some teeth and kind of talked about emphasizing, as they had in the coalition agreement, emphasizing the regional aspect of it, regional stability and previous peace treaties, and also significantly pushed the ball back into the US. So if we assess where it is right now, it's very much, although again, some people here would deny that it is a US initiative. After all, it did come from the Trump plan earlier this year in January. I think to a large extent, if it's still a thing, it depends on the US administration. Right now, with everything they're dealing with, both internally and other policy issues, it's clearly not a priority for them either. But I would flag up the possibility that further we go down, perhaps after the summer, September, October, up and leading up to the November election, if President Trump deems that it's in his interest to push this forward, because it will galvanize the evangelicals or even kind of encourage the Jewish supporters to back him in the election. I think that's crudely where it's at. If Trump assesses that it's in his interest to push this forward, that will create a very challenging dilemma for the Israeli government. As I said, ostensibly this is being pushed by parts of it. The right wing are obviously very keen to see it implemented. But the question is, what's it worth in terms of a cost-benefit analysis if it is just a month or a few weeks up to the election? And obviously, if Trump loses the election, then it's almost worthless, and kind of any trouble that it could cause on the ground or any kind of security issues that could emanate from it would be very difficult to justify in the context of just a few weeks left of a Trump administration. If we get to past November and it hasn't yet returned to the agenda and Trump wins, then I think that very much would be part of an Israeli government thinking as well. So that's kind of is it a thing and the prospects of it happening, and when, in terms of what is it, this is an incredible thing that we still don't know the details. As was laid out back in January, a joint US-Israel mapping team was tasked with the job of taking that very sketchy map that appeared in the Trump plan in January and understanding kind of the details and kind of getting into the real where to draw the line. The other complication is we don't know, when we're talking about drawing the line, whether this is just a temporary move of what Israel is able to annex or extend their sovereignty on at a first stage, or if this is actually kind of in a larger picture setting Israel's final borders in a unilateral sense, which is far more significant. And again, the answers to those questions are still unclear. In terms of the broad boundaries of it, we're talking whether it will be on a small level, just kind of something symbolic over the settlement blocks that, at least for the vast parts of the Israeli society, hold the consensus view. We're talking about Gush Etzion to Jerusalem South, Ma'ale Adumim to the Ma'ale Adumim to the northeast of Jerusalem, and the Ariel salient to consider the blocks. Again, depending on which Israelis you ask for, will tell you how controversial or uncontroversial those things are. Or will it extend to all of the settlements as well, including the outlying settlements, and the Jordan Valley as well, is kind of the huge swathe of land that obviously has also repercussions for Israel's relations with Jordan. So all of that on the scale of it is unknown. And I said it's off the front line news agenda here, primarily because of Corona and other kind of the socioeconomic factors that are weighing in far more heavily. But don't write it off just yet.
Okay. So the second question I had is about something that's happened far more recently, which is the terrible tragedy with the explosion in Beirut. How is that seen from Israel? How do Israelis feel about what's happened to their neighbours? And what, if any, is the connectivity between the events in the Lebanese capital and the stuff that was going on immediately before it happened with the Hezbollah incursions? I think there were two kind of serious terrorist incidents on the Lebanon border. Is there a potential linkage or knock-on impact from the one into the other?
Okay, so again, I'll answer this in a couple of ways. First of all, you know, how is the Beirut explosion seen in Israel? I think on a very simple, base human level, there is a lot of sympathy and understanding for the suffering of innocent Lebanese people, and that is kind of typified and showed. If you saw last week, probably the images of the Tel Aviv municipality that lit up with the Lebanese flag in order to show kind of solidarity with the people, and making a distinction, and this is the really important distinction, between the Lebanese people who are innocent victims of their own corrupt and inept government, and significantly Hezbollah, which Israel does not make the distinction between a military and security wing. It sees Hezbollah as a body that is part of the government, and is very much responsible for the crisis that even predated what happened with the explosion, in terms of the lack of electricity, the lack of food insecurity, and everything else, which is kind of, the country is in collapse and almost going on the verge of bankruptcy. In terms of Hezbollah and the explosion, people in Israel are, I mean, it's security analysts here, are very familiar with Beirut port. Lots of instances. Historically, we can go back kind of even back in the early 80s when Arafat famously escaped out of Lebanon during the first Lebanese war, and there was that famous pictures of Israeli snipers with him in his proving that they could have taken the shot they wanted to. But in more recent time, it's clear that Hezbollah do have in other parts of the port weapons depots and storage places for their rockets, as is kind of their modus operandi in southern Lebanon as well, that we know well from Israeli intelligence, the strong understanding that the way that Hezbollah have kind of infiltrated themselves into the civilian population, particularly amongst the Shiite population of Beirut and of Lebanon, is kind of accusing them of double war crimes when they will, God forbid, fire rockets at Israel and then seek protection under the guise of being under a civilian sites within the Lebanese people. So the Hezbollah and the control, whether this turned out aspects of this explosion was part of a weapons depot, has still not been revealed. It's not impossible, but that we'll have to wait and see. To connect those incidents, as you ask about what was happening and the tension on the Lebanese border, let me just go back and give a little bit of background of what happened there. Israel carries out from time to time operations, mostly in Syria, targeting what they refer to as game-changing weapons imported that could end up in Hezbollah's hands, or in the hands of the Iranian-backed Shiite militias who are building up their forces in southern Syria. And although Israel has in the past claimed and taken credit for hundreds of these sorties, but on every individual act, they often stay quiet and prefer ambiguity. One of these incidences happened a couple of weeks ago, and there was a Hezbollah member that was also killed in the strike. And the equation that Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has tried to build up, and said that he has tried to lay a claim, and part of the deterrence policy, that every time a member of Hezbollah is killed, there will be a revenge attack on Israel. Israel takes Hezbollah's statements, and Nasrallah in particular, very, very seriously indeed, and thus augmented and added up, in fact, the largest troop buildup on the Lebanese border since the 2006 second Lebanese war, and sending the message that if Hezbollah were to attack, then Israel would then respond very forcefully and take that as an opportunity to readdress the balance. Israel's not so happy with the idea that one Lebanese Hezbollah fighter killed should necessitate a response, and they would encourage Hezbollah to be far more circumspect with their own approach. Anyway, we're now talking about 10 days ago, Israel was on this high alert. There was an incident on the border where a cell of Hezbollah operatives came across the border. They crossed over the blue line, which is the internationally recognized border between Israel and Lebanon. And at that point, instead of engaging, I mean, the rules of engagement would usually suggest that this would shot and killed if they're arming into Israeli territory. Instead, Israel, the soldiers on the ground, monitored them on the closed circuit TV, shot at the ground very close to them, and caused them to run away and escape. Israel hasn't released any of this footage, so that's kind of some of this is in the realm of speculation, but people that I trust and that I've heard have seen the footage and do understand that they monitor them for several hours, and this is the nature of the event. The second event that you alluded to was actually a drone that came across also crossed over the skies of Israel, and it must have flown quite high speed across the length of the border, because it succeeded, although not entering into Israel properly, in setting off a series of alarms for the civilians on the northern border, and that was, although it was then declared a false alarm and only later revealed that it was a drone that set it off, kind of speaks to the tension on the border. Now, where are we now? Israel has maintained, and the Chief of Staff has said up until yesterday or the day before, that they are maintaining a high level of alert on the border, because they are still prepared for a Hezbollah reaction. Although other analysts that I've spoken to have suggested that this is a longer term game, and that due to the chaos that is happening in Beirut right now, it's unlikely that we'll see a response attack, but they've got too much on their plate, they're less likely to risk a strike at this time. Nevertheless, Israel stays kind of ready and prepared if they were to choose to attack. One last comment I'll make on this, which is, I think, a fascinating insight. As I described the way that Israel prevented the cell from Lebanon infiltrating and shot and scared them away, less than a week later, another cell, this time from the Syrian border over on the Syrian Golan, also approached into Israeli territory and laid an IED, an improvised explosive device. And on that occasion, Israel was quite firm in striking and killing the 4 people that laid the IED. They also, within hours, released the footage to show what they had done. And then 24 hours later, they struck an SAF, a Syrian Armed Forces position, intelligence gathering, command and control center of where they thought the cell emanated from. And this kind of, for me, it was a very interesting juxtaposition with how carefully Israel responds on Lebanon with regard to Hezbollah, basically heeding the warnings of Hezbollah and taking them very seriously, whilst with Syria they feel they can act with far more vociferous and a vehement response, striking back not only at the cell but also at the place where they were sent to carry out the attack.
Right. Okay. If we move now to domestic issues that are happening inside Israel, so there's something of a second wave of COVID, but I mean, the first one was so tightly contained compared to the UK that it doesn't really bear comparison. So it'd be good to try to understand, what does this actually look like? The Israeli second wave that's being talked about, is it under control again? And the handling of coronavirus, which on the first wave kind of bolstered Netanyahu's reputation. What's the impact of this second wave of it on the domestic political scene?
Okay. Again, a couple of questions there that let me try and break out and answer separately. So in terms of the second wave, and from a medical perspective, we're still nowhere near the levels that the UK reached. We're now just past just over 600 deaths in total. I'd have to check. Don't quote me on this, but I think about 2/3 of those have basically happened within the second wave. The second wave has seen about close to 2,000 people a day kind of being tested positive with new infections. It might be down slightly to 15 or 1,600, but I think it's too early to say whether it's under control. Why we have the second breakout is also still kind of been speculated, but broadly speaking, it seems the nature that when you open up the country too quickly after a closure, and significantly the schools that went back, or now we're in the summer holidays, but the schools that did open quite quickly back in May, and generally kind of the balance that Israel is trying to strike, I presume with the UK as well and everywhere else, between economic growth and dealing with the health crisis at the same time. It's that balance which is still looking to be struck. Israel appointed just over 2 weeks ago what they're referring to as the coronavirus czar, a former Director General of the Health Ministry, a guy called Professor Ronnie Gamzu, who's kind of seen across the board as a very credible player that understands the health necessity, and it was also the director of one of Israel's largest hospitals. So in terms of management credentials, health was to be in the right place at the right time. Interesting that he brought in and implemented straight away was handing over to the IDF within Home Front Command the issue of tracking and tracing the pandemic. One could argue that one of the reasons why it wasn't done beforehand was because of political gamesmanship, sadly. When it first broke out, if you remember, Naftali Bennett was the defense minister. Now, once we have the new government, Benny Gantz is now the alternate prime minister and defense minister. And crudely speaking, it was seen by the commentators here that Netanyahu was reluctant to hand over overall control to the army, lest someone else take the credit for it. I mean, it sounds quite banal and ridiculous to say it out loud, but sadly that is the kind of the working assumption amongst a lot of people here. How has this affected Netanyahu? I mean, first of all, again, people that will our supporters will say, you know, you can't blame a global pandemic on anything. This is obviously far bigger than Prime Minister Netanyahu. Although he clearly has come under some criticism, partly again for the politicization of it, partly again for the other mismanagement and the conflict between the management from the government and how it's related to the Knesset. And why is that important this time? Because the coronavirus law that was passed didn't want it just to be a government decision. They wanted things ratified by the Knesset. And when the Knesset committee, that was actually chaired by a backbench Likud member of Knesset, started challenging the government decisions, then the coalition whip started threatening her with sacking her from the position. They've now slightly rode back from that. But within this context and the issue that a lot of particularly various industries in there were very badly hit, particularly the self-employed and the catering industry and the entertainment industry, and there was a strong feeling that the government wasn't responding quick enough to provide economic help for the people that were suddenly really struggling without an income. What we've seen in terms of demonstrations, and again, probably not dissimilar from other places around the world, but for the last 7 weeks, we've seen demonstrations outside the Prime Minister's residence, also in certain key locations within Tel Aviv. And there's been a tradition over the last month or so that on a Saturday, people going out onto the large intersections and bridges across the country and demonstrating there. And the demonstrators are kind of, there's a whole catch-allism of different issues that people are campaigning against. The common denominator seems to be directed at the Prime Minister. Some of this, again, preceded the coronavirus, claiming that the Prime Minister shouldn't be serving if he's under indictment, an issue that we can talk about if people are interested. Other people complaining against the annexation that we also have discussed, and various kind of other issues, again, tied in with the economic impact of certain sectors, are also out in force to demonstrate against the government.
Okay. Final question with me, we go a bit wider on the domestic politics. So the new coalition government bringing Gantz and kind of leading to a split in blue and white happened, was kind of brought to a head by coronavirus, and it looked like we had an end to the run of elections that there was a period where it just seemed to be going from one election to the next. How, now that it's had a few months in office, what's the kind of state of play with the new government? Is the coalition stable, or is there a risk that we go for end up having a fourth general election?
Okay. So, I mean, the short answer, no, this government is not functioning very well at all. It may be one of the most dysfunctional governments Israel has ever seen, especially kind of this early into its tenure. It's quite striking and shocking. I mean, one of the commentators noted a few weeks ago that it's very, very common that towards the end of a government cycle, the rifts start to appeal, and kind of individual parties need to appeal to their own electorate and differentiate themselves from their previous partners, and so the governments naturally break up. But never has there been a government that was formed already under such hatred is a strong word, but under such strong suspicion and mutual distrust and dislike. And sadly, that's where we are now. I mean, I don't want to give too many predictions, because tomorrow in the Knesset is actually a really significant day that will tell us just how bad things are going. Again, to give a little bit of background, according to standard Israeli law, after every new government comes in, they have 90 days or 100 days to pass a new budget. Bear in mind, this is even more acute, not only because of Corona, but because of the 3 times electoral cycle. Israel hasn't actually passed a budget since the end of 2017, and so has been working off old budgets on a monthly basis. Traditionally, Netanyahu has liked to pass a 2-year budget, because that gives the private sector economy, its private economy, kind of trust and certainty and some guarantees, and it also provides for a level of political stability as well. Suddenly, on this occasion, Prime Minister Netanyahu is insisting on a 1-year budget, because he argues that Corona makes things too unpredictable to long-term planning, whilst all the other economic experts from the finance ministry and the private sector are suggesting, well, first of all, it's the government's job to set those standards and stability. And in any case, because we are now in August, at the end of August, if it gets passed, we're only talking about the phrase here is a budget for the Chagim, obviously referring to the Jewish holidays that are coming up in September, October. So in any case, the 1-year budget actually becomes a 3-month budget and a 4-month budget. And what they should be passing towards the end of a calendar year is the budget for 2021 anyway. Now, the real reasons, or what people suspect, the real reasons behind Netanyahu going for a shorter budget is that he's worked out there is a loophole within the coalition agreement, whereby if they only pass a 1-year budget, and if it expires early next year, then that would precipitate the breakup of the coalition. But the Prime Minister Netanyahu would remain as the interim Prime Minister going into an election campaign. So a lot of people are interpreting this move as basically as a well thought out plan how to avoid honouring the coalition agreement that it says that November 21, Benny Gantz is meant to take over in the rotating prime ministership, and that this, by not passing a 2-year budget, this gives Netanyahu an escape clause to get out of it, and instead also then that will allow him to go to elections and try and build up a small, narrow right-wing government, which could theoretically then pass all sorts of other legislation that he won't be able to do now, primarily talking about the survival of Netanyahu, because don't forget, he's also has his trial coming up that starts the stages of witnesses coming to the stand starting January 2021. So this is all wrapped up in that. Why do I say that tomorrow is such a significant day? Because tomorrow there is a compromise suggestion on the agenda that basically says, let's delay this, because August the 25th is the deadline for passing a budget. If no budget is passed, then that automatically brings us to a disbands and brings us to new elections. So there is a compromise piece of legislation being planned tomorrow that says just to delay that August the 25th date until mid-December, that just gives the sides a little bit more breathing room. And presumably by that stage, the 1-year budget would be almost inconceivable, because we'll already be in December by that time. Aware of that trick as well. It's not yet clear whether, although on Monday it thought that both sides agreed to that compromise of the extension, it now, as we're speaking right now, seems far less clear. So we're going to have to monitor the Knesset. And just to compound the politics, Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition, is bringing a separate bill to the Knesset, or at least is planning to, which says that to ascribe into law that a prime minister under indictment or an MK under indictment cannot be offered the position of prime minister, i.e. that if we were to go to elections, Bibi Netanyahu wouldn't be able to be asked to form a government because he is under indictment. So that will be fascinating. It does get whether there's also two interpretations, whether this is just another excuse to embarrass the blue and white, his former partners, for being part of the government and shame them as because they're not be able to support it. Because if blue and white were to support such a bill, that would almost inevitably lead to the immediate collapse of the government. So it's not clear whether that bill will be tabled in the end, and how other parties will react. So tomorrow is a big day in the Knesset.